So my role tonight is to take you through how we've operationalised some of what Sam has just talked about, as well as to showcase some of the insights from the new index. So we started this whole process by reviewing some scholarly research from a diverse range of fields, including things like leadership, the greater good, public value, social license, and lots of others. We also went back to some of our qualitative data back from 2019, where we talked to a series of leadership experts and got their views on leadership and the way that leadership should be in Australia. We then designed a survey and we ran a series of pilot studies to refine our model further and further. And at the end of that process and lots of hours of analysis, we found that the way that Australians view and think about leadership looks a little bit like this. So working from left to right, we know that public perceptions of leadership are driven by judgments about the integrity of an institution, the contributions that it makes to society, and their competence in doing so. And each of integrity, contribution, and competence can further be broken down into several different sub-attributes. For example, when people think about integrity, they're thinking about transparency, legitimacy, accountability, and lots of other different factors. When thinking about contribution, people evaluate things like financial outcomes, employment opportunities, and things like cultural inclusion and environmental impact. When thinking about competence, they often think about having a clear purpose for existence, demonstrating high levels of skill, decision-making, and efficiency. And so as part of the new index, the survey asks people to rate how institutions are performing on each of these different dimensions and elements. Each metric is measured on an 11-point scale and then is converted to a 0 to 100 score. One of the other big changes that we've made to the index is that we moved from measuring 13 institutions to measuring a total of 25 institutions. And as you can see here, we're tracking institutions like the federal government, the various state governments and local councils, public sector institutions like higher education, health and emergency services, private sector institutions like banking, finance, mining, supermarkets, telecommunications and lots of others, and not-for-profit institutions such as charities, trade unions and professional sporting clubs and associations. So each quarter, the survey collects around 4,000 observations, which consists of around 1,000 people rating 4 randomly assigned institutions. The sample is nationally representative by age, gender and state proportions. And really importantly, we don't just collect all of our data at a single point at the end or the beginning of every quarter. The survey is always on. So meaning that the data collection is spread out throughout the quarter, which reduces some of the timing bias that's typically associated with cross-sectional studies. It also gives us the ability to pulse check how leadership perceptions are changing based on real-world events. The survey also collects extensive profiling information about all the different participants that go through the survey so that we can cut the data by different subgroups of the Australian population. So let's go through some of the results. So looking at overall leadership scores, I think it's safe to say that Australians are disappointed with our leaders. The total leadership score is sitting at 64 out of 100, indicating that there's lots of room for improvement generally. The government sector is performing lowest overall with a score of 58 out of 100. The public sector is performing strongest with a score of 69, which could be a result of its contribution to the pandemic and post-pandemic recovery. And the private sector and the not-for-profit sector sit on 61 and 62 respectively. So let's drill into each one of these a little bit more. So we can see here that when people evaluate the leadership of the government sector, they place an almost equal weighting on integrity, contribution and competence. However, the government sector is currently underperforming on all of these aspects. and there's around a 6 to 8 point gap between the government sector results and the national benchmark for all three components. Looking at integrity specifically, which is the green box, we can see that Australians place a high level of importance on honesty, acting in the best interests of society, and transparency within the government sector. And the government sector is well behind the national score on all of these dimensions. Similarly, for contributions, people value the creation of positive financial outcomes, improving societal welfare, and looking after people's health and well-being. And again, the government is behind the national benchmark. And finally, when it comes to competence, people value reliability, skill, and having a clear vision for the future. And this is perhaps where the government sector falls behind most. Moving on to the public sector, we actually see quite a different story unfolding. When it comes to public sector institutions, Australians place slightly higher importance on competence compared to integrity and contribution, although the latter two are still highly important. And in contrast to the government, the public sector is actually performing strongly compared to the national benchmark, 8 points ahead on integrity, 6 points ahead on contribution, and 4 points ahead on competence. Looking at integrity, we can see that people want the public sector to have genuine motives, to be legitimate, which is lawful, acceptable, and reasonable, and transparent. And the public sector is currently delivering on these, with some room for improvement on transparency. Moving over to contribution, people place high importance on improving societal welfare, looking after health and well-being, and creating employment opportunities. And the public sector is currently outperforming other sectors on these dimensions. And similarly with competence, people place importance on being responsive, creating satisfaction, and operating efficiently in the public sector. And the sector is currently higher than the national benchmark on all three. Despite this positivity though, the scores are still hovering around that sort of 70 out of 100 kind of mark, which means that there is still quite a bit of room for improvement in the public sector. Let's talk about the private sector. So from our modelling, Australians generally see the private sector as highly competent. So it's almost a given. They wouldn't be in business if they weren't. And so they place more importance on integrity and contribution when making judgments about private sector leadership. It's probably not surprising that the private sector is performing above the national benchmark for competence, but below the benchmark for integrity and contribution. Focusing on competence first, we can see that people value reliable decision-making, demonstrating high levels of skill, and operating efficiently, and the private sector is delivering on all of these. But when we look at integrity, this is slightly different. Acting in the best interests of society, behaving ethically, and being honest about their intentions are all important, but the private sector underperforms on all three. And similarly with contribution, improving societal welfare, producing valuable knowledge, and looking after health and well-being are vital, but performance trails behind the national score. So lots of improvement opportunities for the private sector when it comes to integrity and contribution specifically. And finally, the not-for-profit sector. So for this sector, Australians place slightly higher importance on contribution, but integrity and competence also remain a priority. When it comes to contribution specifically, people value improving the welfare of society, looking after health and well-being, and cultural inclusion in the not-for-profit sector. And the sector is currently performing in line with the national benchmark for these dimensions. Moving on to competence, people expect the not-for-profit sector to comply with governance and legal requirements and operate efficiently, but the sector currently falls short on these expectations. And looking at integrity, acting in the best interests of society, trustworthiness and transparency are important, but the sector trails behind the national benchmark for these three dimensions. So a fair bit of room for improvement in terms of competence and integrity in the not-for-profit sector. Lastly, I want to move down to the institutional level and look at how some of the specific institutions are performing on leadership. So here we have the institutions within each sector ranked by their overall leadership scores. In the government sector, we can see that local councils perform best when it comes to leadership, followed by state governments and the federal government. And of course, there's lots of interesting variations in terms of how different state governments perform on leadership once we filter these scores down to people living in each state. So just as an example, we know that Western Australians currently rate their state government at 74 out of 100, which is the highest score out of the state governments. People from New South Wales rate their state government at 64 out of 100, and Victorians are the lowest at 54 out of 100. In the public sector, it's perhaps not surprising that emergency services are performing highest, followed by higher education, health, law enforcement and postal services. It's maybe also not surprising that aged care is performing poorly, given the Royal Commission findings and some of the recent media coverage. In the private sector, supermarkets and pharmaceuticals continue to perform best, while insurance companies, the media and leisure and gaming companies are the worst performers. And in the non-for-profit sector, charities continue to dominate, while trade unions, religious institutions are underperforming. And if your organisation falls into one of these categories, we're now offering opportunities for you to sign up and have your organisation measured and compared to some of these industry benchmarks, with the view to finding areas where improvements can be made, as well as potentially areas where your organisation might be excelling that could be highlighted through communications. Before I hand over to Melissa for the panel discussion, I also wanted to let you know about our new dashboard and website, which has just launched. So on the website, you can explore our range of articles, which are published monthly. There's a set of deep dive reports on leadership in Australia. You can also watch the Future of Leadership series, where we interview influential leaders about the future of leadership in Australia, and subscribe to receive the monthly leadership newsletter. The dashboard, which is free and publicly accessible, is refreshed monthly with new data and allows anyone to explore, monitor and analyse the survey results for themselves. It's an interactive platform where you can cut and filter the data using our full range of metrics and profiling variables. So feel free to jump on and have a look for yourself when you get a chance. Thank you. I hope it's been a little bit insightful, and I will now hand you over to Melissa Wheeler, who's going to introduce our panel for this evening.